Take a look at these borders in Africa. Notice how straight they all are. In this one region where Libya, Egypt, Chad and Sudan meet, there's even perfect 90-degree right angles. In most of the world, borders don't look like this. They are either determined by geography, following large rivers, mountain passes and Great Lakes, or they separate different groups of people. Yet, in Africa, this isn't the case. See, most of these borders were decided only a few centuries ago by a group of men who had no knowledge of the land they were carving up, living in countries thousands of miles away. The question we have to ask is, what are the consequences of these lines drawn on a map so many years ago? Look at these maps. They were drawn by European cartographers during the 1800s, and there's one thing they all have in common. The centre of the continent is notably sparse. See, by the 1800s, many European nations had begun to set up trading posts and coastal enclaves within Africa, but little was known about the interior of the continent. This one map even describes the area as almost entirely unknown. Despite this, Europe soon started to wonder what riches they were missing, which lay further inside the continent. Representatives of 14 European nations gathered in Berlin in 1884 to determine how the entirety of Africa could be colonised. They decided that so long as they effectively occupied an area in Africa, they could claim rights over it. And with this, their scramble for Africa started. In just a few decades, the entire continent was overtaken by colonial forces, nations carving out their own colonies, as agreed with other European nations. And, as they did, they drew on the borders that would come to define these African nations. This got these two economists thinking in terms of how these borders, imposed by European powers, split ethnic groups throughout Africa.
I was, one night going through African flags, just out of curiosity. And I was looking at the Somali flag. So apparently, for the Somalis, the 5-pointed star symbolizes the fact that the Somali nation is split between 5 different entities. The French Somaliland, the British Somaliland, those in Kenya, those in Ethiopia, and those in Somalia. This was actually something very salient for the people of Somalia, that they enshrined it in their national emblem.
To prove this point further, the economists found ethnographic data which showed the distribution of African ethnicities just before European colonization. And by simply adding in the borders of today, they could start to see how ethnic groups were split.
If you put these maps together, lines drawn by Europeans and the ethnic boundaries and ethnic basically homelands, you actually see that a lot of groups found themselves split between different countries.
The Maasai people were split between Kenya and Tanzania. The Anyi people between Ghana and the Ivory Coast. The Chua people between Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe. Without knowing much at all about the interior of the continent, the European colonizers had partitioned Africa, separating hundreds of ethnic groups across multiple nations. The question the economists now started to ask was, in what ways had this process of partitioning impacted on Africa's history? The economists started to think that this action of splitting ethnic homelands across multiple countries might likely have created instability and violence.
Reading a bit the history, what happened, we would often read that skirmishes, conflict would often erupt in these places of split groups.
They formed a hypothesis, predicting that those areas where ethnic groups were partitioned would be the same areas which faced higher levels of political violence today. And so, they set about trying to find an answer. This map starts to explain what they found. It shows all the pre-colonial ethnic homelands in Africa, and the modern-day borders which split them apart. The darker the colour of the area on the map, the more violent events which occurred there between 1997 and 2013. This starts to explain the picture, but to really show what's going on, we have to zoom in. Here, at the intersection of Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we have a truly illuminating example of the effects of the colonial borders. See that in the central regions of Tanzania, where ethnic homelands were not split by national borders, the colour of the map is lighter. Less conflicts occurred here. But look further north to the area where the Rundi group resided, and the story is far different. The Rundi homeland was split amongst all 4 of these countries, and, as shown on the map, has a far higher level of violence today. In the same way, the homelands of the Bashi, the Konju, and the Rwanda, all split into multiple countries, account for 20% of all the conflict in the DRC, despite accounting for just 6% of the population. So, where groups were split, there is more conflict, and where they were not, there is less. Overall, the intensity of conflicts is about 40% higher in areas with partitioned ethnicities.
It is indeed the case that places that are inhabited by partition groups, these are much more likely to actually experience this type of conflict.
This finding makes us ask what really is going on here. Why is it that partition groups face so much more violence?
So what seems to be a common thread across these events, that conflict events that happen in split homelands, is that often neighboring governments would actually use the presence of co-ethnics on the other side of the border to stage an intervention.
So, the borders that a bunch of Europeans drew had consequences which extended far past the period of colonization. They partitioned ethnicities, splitting them into different countries. This only opened the door for civil conflict and unrest, slowing the path towards development for many African nations. Thank you to Stelios Michalopoulos for his support as part of this project. Please watch further videos in our series delivered by Discover Economics and Cage Research Centre. Please visit our website and follow us on social media.